Morning sunshine broke over cloud-covered mountaintops, shooting rays into the valley and enlivening the very shaded greens and mild yellows of the ochres. The sky, a clean, deep blue, appeared and disappeared under large elms gently moving in a warm breeze that carried the smell of cut grass. Rachel double-checked the address on the paper she carried, then walked through an old-fashioned wooden gate and down a stone path that led to a front porch filled with comfortable chairs and large pots of flowers and plants. She knocked on the door and listened to a wind chime made of copper wire and wafers of agate that glowed in the sun. She admired a varnished wooden milk box covered in hand-carved western scenes, Indians on horseback hunting buffalo, and old cowboys standing around a campfire. She thought if she ever married and had a family, she would have a home like this. As Mrs. Wallace answered the door, a birdsong escaped from somewhere behind her. She smiled. A thin, elderly woman in overalls and tennis shoes, and put her fists on her hips, more like a superhero would than somebody's grandmother. "Just in time," she said with a spunky, bright voice. None of the little old lady vulnerability she thought she had heard over the phone. "Please follow me." Rachel passed through a living room decorated in varnished rustic pine wood, Indian blankets, and deer, sheep, buffalo, and bear hides. Petrified wood, fossils, arrowheads, pyrite, agate, and other colorful minerals she couldn't identify filled shelves next to books on ghost towns and lost gold mines. An old-fashioned rifle hung over the stone fireplace. The kitchen, warm and smelling of baked bread, caused her heart to leap and long for a place of her own. Copper utensils adorned the walls. Pretty ceramics filled the counters. Nothing made in Japan, she assumed. Mrs. Wallace took her out through a creaky screen door which banged shut behind her and into another world, a place she never would have thought existed if casually passing by on the street. A large, lush garden extended to lines of fruit trees. Beyond them, grand elms stretched to the sky, blocking any view of the adjoining neighborhood. Chickens scattered away from the stone path, and two playful border collies ran up barking and sniffing at Rachel. Mrs. Wallace grumped at them, and they heeled and allowed Rachel to pet them. In the distance, an old gray barn sagged with age. They crossed a ditch and entered the shade of a large walnut tree. Several sheep grazed in a nearby field. "This is what I wanted you to see," Mrs. Wallace said, leading Rachel to a stable filled with hay. A fat ewe lay on her side, stretching her neck and letting out low groans. "That's Abby. She's about to give birth." Rachel felt her eyes widen and her heart quicken. She'd never seen an animal give birth except on public television, and then she would change channels to find a show she'd rather watch, like Silver Spoons or Cagney and Lacey. She hoped she wouldn't throw up or pass out. I wanted to thank you for the opportunity to..." That's quite all right, sweetheart," Mrs. Wallace said. "Just watch." The ewe strained and shifted. Her hind leg kicked, moving hay back and forth. She seemed not to notice the two visitors who watched her from the entrance. Mrs. Wallace took Rachel gently by the arm and led her, ducking under supports, to the other side of the table. From there, Rachel could see the swelling and widening birth canal. She put a hand over her nose and mouth. "Do you see its little head?" Mrs. Wallace said. The ewe strained again as a gray, slippery mass appeared. Amniotic fluid and blood spread onto the hay. "What do we do?" Rachel whispered. "Nothing. It's a good birth." A head and two shiny hooves quickly popped out. The ewe shuddered and groaned and strained. Then the tiny lamb slid out onto the hay and shook its head. It breathed and shivered, vulnerable and skinny. The new mother rested a moment, then carefully stood, sniffed her baby, and began to lick the little wet creature until it kicked its legs and let out little bleats. "Kindly bring me a bucket of water or two to put through the trough," Mrs. Wallace said. "When you're finished, meet me in the kitchen." Rachel followed her out from under the shade of the walnut tree. Mrs. Wallace pointed at a stack of buckets by a spigot on the side of the house. Rachel wasn't sure how to judge the woman. She seemed almost stern, intimidating, yet friendly at the same time. Insects whirred through flowering herb and flower gardens. Young tomatoes weaved through wire supports. The summer heat came early, and Rachel thought bringing a hat next time would be smart. When she had the bucket filled, the dogs followed her back to the trough on the side of the stable and drank when she poured the water. The little lamb, standing, poked its face up into its mother's udder, and Rachel wondered how a newborn creature could know how to find its mother's milk, let alone stand. Once again, she felt on the edge of some great answer.